to Zechariah chapter 9, and we're going to be looking at verse 12. Now, before we do that, I'm going to give you a little bit of context, backstory to why Zechariah actually wrote this. So, when Zechariah wrote this, the children of Israel were actually in bondage, but it didn't start there. It started 70 years ago under King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar is the same king that we find in the book of Daniel. He threw Daniel in the lion's den. He threw the Hebrew boys in the fire. King Nebuchadnezzar was a ruthless man. He ruled with power and with authority. If you disobeyed him, that's your life. He ruled so much that way that in the Bible, he is called the destroyer of nations. And if we were putting that in today's terms, if this was the Marvel universe, he would be considered Thanos. Everywhere he went, there was destruction. There was chaos because he ruled that way. And for 70 years, they were sitting under this king. They were oppressed by this king for 70 years. At the end of those 70 years comes King Cyrus. King Cyrus defeats King Nebuchadnezzar. He decided to rule a different way. So King Cyrus didn't want to rule with power and with war. He tried to rule politically. And so when the children of Israel ended up under King Cyrus, he gave them the ability to go back to their homeland, to Jerusalem. He said, you can go back and rebuild your temple. Now, the interesting thing about that is back in the book of Jeremiah in chapter 30 and verse 3, God actually gave the children of Israel a promise. He said, after your bondage, I will allow you to go back to your land to rebuild the altars and to rebuild the temple. And so when they were hearing this, they had to think about that promise. God is sending us back. And so they allow these people, they allow the Israelites to go back. He sends out an edict throughout the entire land. Now, there are millions of Israelites in this land at this time. And a total of 42,000 Israelites answered the call. Out of millions of people, there's only 42,000 Israelites that decided to go back to their homeland. And if you think about it, it makes sense. They've been in bondage for so long that some of them actually forgot that they were in bondage. They lived there. They grew up there. That's all they know. But there was a remnant, about 42,000, that decided to go back. And they were led by a guy by the name of Zerubbabel. That's a hard name to say. I would never name my kid that. But anyway, his name is Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel and this small band of people decided to go back. And they go back with all this enthusiasm because they have that promise before them. God said he's going to do this. We're actually walking this out. And so they go back, and in the first 7 months, they rebuild the altar. It took 42,000 people 7 months to rebuild an altar. The altar was not a small structure. It's this huge structure that the Israelites used to worship God. This is where they made their sacrifices. This is where they made the animal sacrifices. This is where they made the grain sacrifices. This is how they repented before God. We don't have to do that today, but back then, that is exactly how they did it. And so they rebuilt this altar in 7 months. And they took that same enthusiasm, that same excitement, and they went to go rebuild the temple. And for a while, things were going really good rebuilding the temple. And then all of a sudden, the Samaritans showed up. Now, if you're not familiar with the Samaritans, let's jump ahead to the New Testament. So in the New Testament, Jesus runs into a woman at the well. She's a Samaritan. And she asks Jesus a question. She said, how can you, a Jew, be speaking to me, a Samaritan? But let's take it a little bit further. Jesus gives a story about the Good Samaritan. Now, if you understand, the Jewish people hated the Samaritans. So to them, there's no such thing as a Good Samaritan. But it didn't start in Jesus' day. It actually starts way back here. And so they're trying to rebuild this temple, but the Samaritans are stopping them at every turn. Everywhere they look, they're there. They fought them so much that they actually stopped rebuilding the temple. For 16 years, they stopped rebuilding the temple. For 16 years, they were in the land of Jerusalem. They were close to the temple. They were close to their promise. But because of the opposition, they stopped for 16 years. 16 long years, they walked by the temple, wondering if God was going to fulfill his promise. They couldn't continue because of the Samaritans. That is why Zechariah is actually writing what he's writing. So Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 12, it says, return to your stronghold, O prisoners of hope. Today I declare I will restore double. He's encouraging them to go back to the temple, even in the midst of opposition. Now, I'm sure by now some of you guys have heard that I had a kidney transplant. And before that story gets out and everything gets confused, I'm going to give you the whole story. And my story actually starts way back in 2017, October of 2017. We're living in Indiana. I'm working for a nonprofit, and it's going really, really good. I liked Indiana, except during the winter months, which was like 8 months. I enjoyed Indiana. And so we're there, and me and my wife, and it's going great. It's pretty easy. It's simple. And I love it. If you were here on Monday, you would have found out that I am a frugal, cheap person. So one of the great benefits of living in Indiana was we were paying $750 a month for where we were living. 4-bedroom house, 2 bathrooms, huge yard. You kidding me? What? I loved it. And so we were living there in Indiana, and then I get a call. I get a call from a friend of mine, my best friend actually, and he says, hey, the church that I'm at, they need help. Would you mind coming down to check it out? My first thought was, no, there's no way I'm leaving where I'm at. But it was my best friend that made the phone call, so I felt obligated to come. So I come down, I interview with the church. It was a great time. They paid for everything. It was wonderful. I loved it. It was like a mini vacation. And so they bring me down. I talk with them. I get back home, and my wife asked the question, how did it go? It went okay. I don't think I'm going to end up in Florida anytime soon. That's what I told her. And then I got this poke. I felt like God was poking me saying, hey. And I'm like, no, because I know what that poke means. No, I don't want it. And so he did it again. Hey, no, I don't want it. He said, I need you in Florida. Why do you need me in Florida? Do you know how expensive it is in Florida? Do you know how hot it is in Florida? No, I don't want to go. I'm here, so eventually I lost. But I didn't want to go. And so I get home. I'm fighting with God for maybe a week. And so I said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask my wife. She says no, it'll be great. So I said, God is telling me to do this. And you got to understand, my wife at this point has never left the state of Indiana. So I was like, this is a sure thing. This is not going to happen at all. And then I talked to her, and she says, I don't want to go, but if that's what God is saying to you, then we have to go. Man, are you kidding me? You should have said no. And so that's the first time. The second time, I went and asked our pastor. Loved our pastor. We were working at the church, serving at the church. It was a great time. So I said, I'll ask the pastor. He'll tell me to stay. I was just trying to find the answer I wanted. And so I talked to the pastor. He says the same thing. I don't want you to go, but if God is telling you to go, you need to go. Man, really? I got to go? So eventually, October 18th of 2017, I hop in my 2007 Chevy Avalanche, and I drive 15 hours from Indiana to Tampa, Florida. I get here, and I'm like, oh, it's not so bad. Okay, what was I worried about? From October 28, 2017 until February 8th, 2018, things were going great. Going great. I loved it. I was like, oh, man, you got to get here. My wife was still in Indiana because our kids were finishing school. She was coming down in March of that year. February 8th. February 9th, I'm hanging out at a friend's house, the same friend that called me down here. Hanging out at his house, having a good time. We were eating wings, watching a basketball game. Then I leave his house. I go home to clean up because I have visitors coming. One of my best friends was driving from Tennessee, coming up to see me to check out Florida. And since my wife wasn't at the house, that place was a wreck because it's just me. There's nobody else there, so I wasn't accountable to anybody. So it was a wreck in there. So I cleaned up the house. I go to lay down, and I couldn't catch my breath. And I start coughing. And I was like, this seems like bronchitis or something. I'm like, I don't have time for this. I have to go to the emergency room to get it checked out. So I go to the emergency room. They check me out. They're like, oh, yeah, you probably got bronchitis. Let's fill out these papers, and we'll get you home. And then as soon as he gets to the threshold of the door, he stops. He turns around, and he says, for some reason, I need to check your kidneys. He said, it doesn't make sense because all your numbers are fine. Everything looks great, but I need to check your kidneys. I said, if that gets me out of here faster, cool. So he checks my kidneys. He goes to get the results. And then he's gone for 10 minutes. And I'm like, oh, he must have got lost. 20 minutes, I start to get concerned. 30 minutes, I'm like, there's definitely a problem. 30 minutes later, he walks into the door. Now, he left by himself, but he comes back with 2 other doctors. He comes back with a nephrologist and a surgeon. Now, the nephrologist is a kidney specialist. I learned that from all this. I didn't know that at the time. And the surgeon was there because they wanted me to have surgery. So this was happening on February 9th. Mind you, my wife is in Indiana, so she has no idea any of this is going on. And I couldn't call her because I don't charge my phone, which is a really, really bad habit. So I couldn't call her. February 9th. I'm laying in the ICU room because they wouldn't let me leave. They said, hey, you're not leaving. We're going to admit you. You have to go up to the ICU room. I get into the room. I call my wife. Of course, she freaks out over the phone. What do you mean you're in the hospital? You're in the ICU? What did you do? Oh, man, I didn't do it this time. Really, I didn't. And so I call her. I tell her where I'm at. And then she said, I'll be down February 12th to come see you in the hospital. The doctors come back in. And they're saying, hey, you're going to have surgery. You're going to have surgery for dialysis. Now, there are 2 places that they give you surgery for dialysis. First is here. They will put a port here, or they put it in your arm right here. It's called a fistula. And that's so you can receive dialysis so that it can clean your blood. Because if your kidneys are shutting down, your body is producing toxins and it can't get rid of it. So they tell me that they're going to have surgery. Mind you, at this time, they haven't told me what's exactly going on with my body. So I look at the doctor and I say, so what's going on? Because I'm nervous at this point. You want to cut me open? I have no idea why you want to perform a surgery. And then he looks at me and he says, your kidneys are functioning at 2%. He said, that is a stage 5 kidney disease. There's no way you should have been able to walk to this hospital through these doors. There's no way. You should be sick. You should be deathly ill. But for whatever reason, you're not. That was February 9th. February 10th, I am begging God, I don't want a surgery. I still don't really know what's going on. They're saying they want to cut me open. They're saying I have some type of kidney disease, but I feel fine, except I really, really hate being in this room. Nothing. I didn't hear anything. Silence. February 11th, begging God again, praying again, God, get me out of here. And then I felt like God spoke 2 things to me. 1, he said, I'll take care of your kidney disease. And 2, you're not going to have surgery for the fistula. I said, okay. That calmed me down for maybe 5 minutes. After that, I started freaking out again, started praying again. God, get me out of here. February 12th. That's the day my wife was coming to see me. February 12th, the associate for the doctor comes in. He says, hey, we're going to prep you for surgery. So they roll me back to the prep room. They stick me full of IVs, needles, and all those things to get me ready for surgery. And they roll me back out to my room. This whole time, I'm like, I thought I heard you, God. I thought that I was not going to have this surgery, but yet they are prepping me for this surgery. I felt like God gave me a promise, but my situation did not look like it at all. And so he grabs the bed, and he is rolling me out the door, getting ready to roll me down the hallway to get me into the surgery room so they can perform this surgery. Have you ever been there where you know God has made you a promise, but your situation does not look like it? That God has said something to you, but your situation is saying, no, he did not? That you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that God said, yes, I will do this for you, or yes, start that business, or yes, get married, or yes, you're going to have children. Have you heard that from God? But yet, your situation doesn't say it. That's where the children of Israel found themselves. They went back to the homeland because of the promise that God made, and then they started out, and it was great. It was great. It was wonderful for 7 months. It was wonderful. And then the Samaritans showed up. So do you have a Samaritan? Is there something stopping you from believing that God is going to perform the promise that he is giving you? Is there something that's keeping you on the sidelines even though you know you should be in the game? Because for them, it was the temple. You got to understand the temple represented to them the presence of God, the purpose of God, the peace of God, because that's how they interacted with God. Everything happened through the temple. If the temple was there, God was there. So when the temple was destroyed, there's no God. So to them, that is how they interacted with God. That's how they knew God. That's how they saw God. That's their promise. Because through God, he promised that he was going to bless the earth. So whenever they saw the temple, they would remember the promise. And yet, the temple was destroyed, and they'd walk by it for 16 years. 16 years, they allowed situations and certain things to happen that they no longer built on that. For 16 years. What do you do when for 16 years you believe in God for something? You know he made that promise. What do you do? Now, I didn't have to wait 16 years, but that was a long 4 days in ICU. Very long 4 days. And so they're about to roll me down the hallway. And as they're getting ready to roll me down the hallway, I take a breath and I say, God, maybe I misheard you. If I have to have this surgery, then so be it. Not 10 seconds later, another nephrologist comes in and stops the guy from pushing me down the hallway. At this point, I still have no idea what's going on. She goes and talks to him. He rolls me back into the room. And at this point, I'm like, uh-oh, what's going on now? Is there another problem? Is there another issue? What is the problem? She looks at me and she says, even though your kidneys are definitely at 2%, your body is functioning like you don't have a kidney disease. And we are scared to open up your body because we might cause an issue that we can't fix. That was February 12th. So my wife comes, she gets me from the hospital. Side note, I'm not a small guy. I'm short, but I'm not a small guy. And on my way out the hospital, I pass out. My wife is trying to help me get to the car, and I hit the ground. Hit the ground for maybe 30 to 35 seconds. I bounce up. My wife is screaming, you need to go back to the hospital. My first thought was, no, I'm not going back to the hospital. I just got out of there. I passed out, so what? I'll be fine. It's not going to bother. I won, so I went home. And we started this process where we had to go see doctors, nurses, and all of those things. This was February 2018. Now, if you remember, in October of 2017, God told me to come down here. He prodded me to come down here. And so at this point, I'm like, God, there's no way that you brought me this far from Indiana to Florida for a kidney disease. You could have did all of that in Indiana. I liked Indiana. So why am I here in Florida? Why? And it's funny how God operates like that. The way that you think he should operate, it never, ever happens. Never. And I don't know if that's because, well, I do know it's because God knows way more than we do. He knows every situation. And so what happened was we started going through this process, and I started getting hope again, like, okay, maybe I can work through this thing. We can work through this thing. So we eventually find a place called the Largo Medical Center. It's a transplant center. We get interviewed, because you have to get interviewed in order to get accepted, and then once you're accepted, you get put on a list. So we had the interview, I get accepted, and I'm put at the bottom of the list. This list is long. And once I got accepted on the list, she said it's going to take 5 years before you even get close to getting a kidney. That was February of 2018. 5 years. And then she said, but we don't know if you have 5 years. So what you need to start doing is looking for a kidney donor. And so when we first left it, oh man, we started talking about it everywhere we went, and we had a ton of candidates. But none of them were a match. None of them. At this point, I'm like, God, what's going on? Did you forget about me? Because remember, he made 2 promises. He already fulfilled the first one. He said, hey, I'll get you out of here without the surgery. I was still waiting on the second promise because I'm still dealing with this kidney issue. I'm still dealing with this kidney problem. I still had all these concerns. I still had all those Samaritans that I was still fighting. I was still fighting my health. I was still fighting where I was supposed to be. We were still considering if we're supposed to be here or not. So there was all these issues that I'm still fighting on top of waiting for the promise of God. So what about you? Is there something that you're still fighting while you're waiting on the promise of God? Is there something in your life that is keeping you from pursuing what God has placed in your heart to do? This is where we find the Israelites. So they spent 80-something years in bondage. They're this close to the promise, but they can't get to it yet. They can see it, but they can't touch it. And that's what I felt like. God, I see all these things. I see your hand moving, because there were times where my numbers would go up, which was really, really good. My kidney actually jumped from 2% to 13%. And I was like, oh, I know how God's going to do it. He's just going to heal me completely. My numbers got all the way up to 22, 23%, and then they tanked. They dropped. My kidney went right back down to 2%. So we're dealing with all these issues, all these concerns. 2019. 2019, I'm like, God, it's been a year. I don't even know if I heard you right. I don't even know how long I have left, because 5 years is a long time to wait if you don't know you're going to be here. So what do you do? So I did exercise. I was on a diet. My wife and her dad call it sticks and weeds, because literally it was sticks and weeds. It was really, really bad. But I was on this diet, and I was doing everything I knew to do, but yet my situation was not changing. And then, if you guys were here on Sunday, you would have met a woman by the name of Michelle. How I ran into Michelle. The first week of September, I get a phone call from the transplant center. I ignore the phone call. No, I ignore the phone call because they call me all the time. They called to say, hey, make sure your numbers are right. Hey, did you get your test? Hey, did you go see this doctor? Hey, did you do this? So I ignore it, and then I usually go back and listen to it. This time, they called my wife, and they said, your husband needs to call us back ASAP. And the lady is in tears on the other side of the phone. I call my wife. Well, my wife calls me, and she says, you need to call the transplant center. And I'm like, what for? They're just going to tell me I need to go run my numbers. She said, no, you need to call them right now. And being married, when my wife says right now, I kind of get the message. When she says right now, it means right now, not later, not 10 minutes later. It means now. So I hang up the phone, and I call the transplant center. And this lady is in tears on the other side of the phone. She can't catch her breath. She is boo-hooing. So for like 2 to 3 minutes, I just let her cry because I didn't know what to say. And then she finally gets the words out. We found a match for you. I'm driving down the road and I drop my phone. So I pull over. I pick up my phone and I said, you did what? She said, we found a match for you. I said, there's no way you guys found a match for me. You said 5 years. She said, I know, but we found a match for you. Now, how they find matches, it's not just that the kidney has to match. You have to be approved by the board. So once they give you a kidney match, the board actually meets, and they're like, who needs this kidney the most? And you got to remember, I'm at the very bottom of the list. And she said, once everybody sat down in that room, your name came out of everybody's mouth. So I went from 5 years to 5 days. September the 11th, I received a kidney transplant. And I received it from the woman by the name of Michelle. Michelle was here last Sunday, and she surprised us. We had no idea she was coming. The second promise got fulfilled. Not the way that I thought he was going to fulfill it, but he did. So then I would pose the question to you. How long do you have to wait before you believe God will fulfill the promise he gave to you? Because it says in Numbers chapter 23 and verse 19 that God is not a man that he should lie, nor the son of man that he should repent. If he said it, he's going to do it. If he promised it, he's going to make it good. He says that he watches over his word to perform it. He says that his word will never leave him. It will never fail him. Heaven and earth will pass away, but his word will never pass away. So if God has made you a promise, if God has said something to you, then you can take it to the bank, because hope delayed is not hope denied. So you can hope in the promise that God has given you, because God watches over that to perform it. And so Zechariah gives them 2 things they need to do and a promise. The first part of the verse, he says, return to your stronghold. The stronghold for them, it was the temple. Return to your promise. Don't forget what God has promised you. Because if God said it, he's going to do it. So return to the promise. Secondly, he calls them a prisoner of hope. Now, how many of you have seen the show Locked Up or A Woman Behind Bars? I didn't even know that show existed until my wife. I had no idea. So I grew up that way, so I didn't want to see it. She did not, so she was entertained by it. I'm not entertained by those shows, but she loves those shows. But anyway, when you're a prisoner, you are bound to that system. They tell you when to wake up. They tell you when to go to sleep. They tell you when you can eat, what you can eat, how you can eat. They control you. You're bound by that. No matter how hard you want to be free, no matter where, if you want to go somewhere else or not, you are controlled by that. You are bound by that. And he calls them a prisoner of hope. Because once God makes a promise to you, no matter how hard you try to fight it, no matter how hard you try to shake it, you just can't do it. And I know that from experience. God called me at the age of 20 to preach the gospel. I told him no, and that turned out pretty well. But I told him no, and I started to run from it, and I tried my hardest to run from it. I said, I'd do anything else. God, I'll give you 90% of my money if that's what it's about. Here, take it all. I just don't want to do this. And he said, okay. And here I am. But God watches over his promise to perform it. You're bound by it. No matter where your actions take you, you're going to always come back to the promise because you're a prisoner of hope. If you are found in Christ, you have no other choice. You're a prisoner of hope. And then he says, today I will restore double to you. Now this is where it gets really, really interesting. So after my surgery, I go home. I had to be in my house for about 90 days, somewhere around there. For 90 days, I'm in my room or in the house. Drove my wife absolutely crazy. Because there's only so many movies you can watch, only so many books you can read. There's only so much you can do. And I did it all in about 5 or 6 hours. So she still had 89 days to put up with me. And she works from home. So when she was not on the phone or when she's not working, I'm in her face because I have to talk. I have to be seen. And so I was driving her crazy. And then one day she says to me, you just need to go pray. Excuse me? Go pray. I'm working. Oh, okay. Again, that tone of voice. So, okay, I'll go. So I started praying. And I was thanking God, thank you, God, that you gave me a kidney. Went from 5 years to 5 days. Thank you, God, that I am in Florida. And then I pause. Why am I in Florida? What am I doing here? You didn't bring me here for a kidney. There's no way you brought me all the way down here for a kidney. And so me and God are going back and forth. A couple of days. Then I get an email that I almost missed. I got an email from Rob Duford. And it ended up in my spam box. So the day that I received that email, I said, hey, I'm going to close out my email and just move on with my day. And then I got a little poke. I know that poke because that poke ended me here in Tampa. Tampa in Orlando. So I paid attention to it. It said, check your spam box. There's nothing in there but junk. That's why it's called spam. I got the poke again. Check your spam box. Okay, all right, there's nothing there, but I'll check it. So I checked the box. And maybe 10 minutes earlier, he sent the email. At the very top is his email address. And he says, hey, you don't know me. I don't know you. But I found your resume, and we're looking for a youth pastor. And I thought about it. Did you bring me all the way down here for this? Is this what it is? Are you sure? I was like, God, I am 36 years old. I've been in youth ministry for a long time. I started early. I was in youth ministry for a long time, and being 36, I was like, there's no way, God. You're done with me. You're done with me. He made a promise to me when I was 20 that I would be doing this. That was 16 years ago. I'm 36 today. But it started right there. I was like, there's no way that I'm going to do this. And then that poke came back again. Yes, you are. Oh, here we go. Got to do this again? Yes, you do. So I respond to the email. Say, hey, yeah, I'm interested in having a conversation. Now, when we first had the interview, I purposely tried to fail the interview. I did. I purposely tried to fail it because I was like, the only way out of this is to have a really bad interview. But the problem was, it was a great interview. I really liked talking to Rob. And I was like, uh-oh. Okay, so maybe you're not done. And I tried to ignore it for a while. I was like, oh, we had a good conversation, but I don't think anything's going to happen. And even so much so, I brought my wife into the interview. She didn't even know it. I brought her into the interview because like, oh, yeah, he's definitely going to fire me after this. He's not even going to continue this interview. So I bring my wife in, and she's all disheveled, and he's like, oh, this is awesome. I'm like, jeez. So we had a great conversation. And then a couple of conversations later, we had a meeting. My wife, my family, and I had a meeting with Rob and the elders. Again, in my head, I'm like, I wonder if I can fail this thing. Because I was like, there's no way, God. I'm too old to be a youth pastor. I would love to do it again, but I'm 36. And he says, so we go see this thing to the elders, and we're sitting at the food court. And I don't remember what we were eating, but I was interviewed by everybody, and it was a nice time. And then it came down to Gary. Gary grilled me up and down, left and right, inside and out. Gary asked every question imaginable. And I was like, oh, I'm for sure failing this thing, talking to Gary. And when we left that interview, I said, everything went great, but I don't think Gary likes me. That's what I told my wife. I said, there's no way that he likes me. A few weeks later, they offer us the position. We accept it, and we're sitting at Rob's house. This is the first encounter I have with Gary outside of that grilling that he gave me. Gary's laughing and smiling, and I'm like, you hate me. What am I doing here? So he sits on the couch, and then he starts talking about how much he loves us. And I am confused. I'm like, where did this come from? And he's glowing, and he's talking about all these things, and he's like, I just felt in our heart that it was the right move. And I'm like, is this the same Gary that I met at the food court that was grilling me up and down? It was bananas. But what this did was it fulfilled a promise that God made to me 20 years ago. So I've been in ministry for a long time, and one thing that's extremely important to me is my family. We've worked at a few churches, and so I want to make sure that my family is seen and taken care of. Because being up front, it's easy for me to be seen and being taken care of. But it's extremely hard for somebody to pay attention to my family. So we were in a few churches, and that was the case. They would always think that she was either a guest or that she was somebody new or that they didn't know my kids. It was this thing. Even though I was there day in and day out, Sunday through Saturday. They knew me, but they didn't know my wife. One of the promises that God made to me was that I would not have to sacrifice my family for ministry. And so what sold us on Orlando North was not the fact that Gary liked me or that they interviewed me. It was the fact that they saw my wife, that they saw my kids. This was a promise that God made to me 20 years ago. 20 years ago when I was 16, God said, yes, I'll be able to do that. 20 years has passed since then. It took God 20 years, and it took him 20 years because he had to grow me for 20 years. He had to develop me for 20 years. But not only that, he had to make this place. You guys were not here 20 years ago. So if God would have answered it any sooner, I probably would have been messed up. So here we are. But that's the same for the children of Israel. He said, hey, first you got to return to your promise. What have I promised you? God didn't bring me here for a kidney. He took care of the kidney while I was here. But he brought me here for here. So what about you? How long has it been? How long have you been waiting for God to show up in the miracle that he's promised you or what he's called you to do? Did God say you were going to have children, but you don't have them yet? Did God say start the job, but you haven't started it yet? What is it that God has promised you that you have not yet done? Is it because the opposition might seem too strong or that you don't see God moving in that way? Because I can guarantee you that when I got here, I did not anticipate that we would be here. I thought we would be back in Indiana. I liked Indiana, except for the winter months, which was about 8 months out of the year. Other than that, I enjoyed it. I really liked it. Had a great time there. And so when we got here, I was like, God, it's too hot. Oh, God, I don't want to be here. The job was great, but no, God, take me back to Indiana. It's a lot cheaper there. I can do that. And he said no. See, the kidney problem is actually what kept me here. If I didn't have that kidney problem, we wouldn't be here because we still would not be in Florida. So even though back in 2017, when God called me here and I didn't know why he called me here, he was working a plan. So even though when he called the Israelites back to their land, he was working a plan the entire time. And it's the same for you. You might not see it yet. You might not feel it yet. It might not seem like it's going to happen, but God is working a plan. And so we have to be patient in God's plan. And it is hard to be patient. It's extremely hard to be patient, especially when you're so close to the promise, you can almost taste it. Extremely hard. So he says, return to the promise. Secondly, you're a prisoner of hope. There's nothing you can do about it. If God has made you a promise, you cannot get away from it no matter how hard you try. The children of Israel were in bondage for 80 years. 70 years with the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. And then they were up to this point 16 years with King Cyrus. 16 years with King Cyrus. That's a long time to hold on to a promise. A long time to believe God is going to work it out. But he did. And he also said, finally, he says, hey, today I will restore double to you. Now, this is where it gets interesting because God did restore the temple. But if you continue to read, it's actually talking about Jesus coming. Because in the verse number 1, it says, you're going to see your king riding on a donkey, which references Jesus Christ. So he was actually fulfilling 2 promises. He says, and yes, you'll be able to do the temple. You'll be able to rebuild the temple. You'll be able to rebuild the altar. You'll be able to serve me that way. But yet there is somebody coming that is greater than this temple, that is greater than your problem, that is greater than your issue. That is what he was talking about. Fulfilling it in 2 ways. It's funny how God works that way. Because the way that I thought he was going to heal me, he didn't do it. The way that I thought we would end up in ministry, he didn't do it. Because personally, I wanted to be at Ohio. That's where I thought I was going to be. I'm a big Ohio State fan. I was like, yeah, we're going to be in Ohio. God said no. So, and I was brokenhearted when I first got the diagnosis. Because I said to myself, there is no way that God is going to continue to fulfill the promises that he made for me 20 years ago. There's no way. I'm sick. I don't know if I'm going to make it 5 years. Every candidate we send to the center is denied. I don't understand what you're doing, God. I don't see it. I don't feel it. And all the while, he was working this plan. He was working it out. So, as I get ready to close, I want to pray for 3 people specifically. 1, you know that God is giving you a promise. You know in your heart that he's giving you a promise. But it doesn't look like it. Your situation does not look like it. Number 2, for those that feel like they don't have a promise yet, God says a lot about you in the scriptures. There's plenty of promises that you can hold on to. And then 3, there's no greater hope that we can believe in than the hope of eternal life through Jesus Christ. There's no greater hope. God loves you with an everlasting love. A love that we cannot comprehend, a love that we cannot understand, but a love that we get to embrace, a love that we get to take a part in. He sent his son to die on the cross for us before we even knew him. He loved us before we even loved ourselves. He made the ultimate sacrifice on the ultimate altar. So they're here, they're building this altar, and they're resurrecting the temple. And yet God is working the plan of salvation all the way through it. He confirms it to him. He said, hey, your king is coming. Your king is coming. So while they're working this plan, so while I was working this plan, I was like, hey, I'm in Florida. I don't know why yet. And I'm working this way because of my kidney problem. I'm doing all this. And yet God is saying, hey, I still have another plan for you. Hey, I still have something to fulfill for you. I'm still holding on to that promise. And God does it. But it's the same for you because I'm nobody special. I come from a small town in Tennessee called Cleveland, Tennessee. There's nothing there but churches. Everywhere you look, there's churches. Nothing there. And if God would pick me up out of a small town in Cleveland, Tennessee, and bring me all over the place to end up here, what does he have in store for you? Because I'm nobody at all. And yet God did it for me. So if God did it for me, I can guarantee you God's going to do it for you. Lord, I thank you.